everybody. Thanks for being here. Happy Monday. My name is Heather. I'm the senior planner here with the City of Jacksonville Beach. And this is our second public workshop to talk about the impacts of sea level rise and spring tide and storm surge and all those things combined. We got a grant through Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and we've hired these wonderful folks over at Stearns Weaver Miller to help us fulfill the grant requirements, and they've been doing a fantastic job. So the first workshop, was anybody here for that? I know Sandy was. Yay, the Margos, yay. We got more into like the data and the mapping and what all that produced through that process. Now we're going to get into a little bit more of the policy stuff, but Ken will cover the background of the phase one, how we got to where we are, and then he'll talk about the proposed changes to our comprehensive plan. And this is all for us to meet some Florida statutes for coastal communities that are impacted by this. We have to do this so that we are in compliance with Florida statutes. So staff's here to answer any questions. Ken is really good with the technical stuff, not so much me, but he can answer a lot more questions probably than I can. So with that, you have the clicker, you're ready to go.
Well, thank you for coming out, everyone. As Heather mentioned, I'm with Stearns Weaver Miller. We're a law firm actually, but we do planning and legal work around the state. And most of my work is really in the private sector with developer clients and helping clients with transactions and that kind of work, but due diligence kind of work. But I like to do public projects. I was in the public sector for almost 20 years, so it kind of gets in your blood. And so I do one or two public projects pretty much every year. I just enjoy them. They're different than my run-of-the-mill developer work. So I mentioned the city was awarded a DEP grant in September. We helped file that application. We've been contracted to carry out that grant work, and we're working closely with Heather and Bill, me and your planning director, and they've been very helpful, in giving me feedback as we go along and making sure that I'm understanding kind of the nuances of the city. This city is built out for the most part, so there are limited options in terms of solutions that we can pursue. It's not like some areas where you can maybe just start moving backwards. Don't really have that option here. And that's pretty much the way it is in probably half the coastline in Florida. It's kind of in the same pickle. So we're going to go through our phase one process that we went through. I want to just recap that for you since many of you weren't there for the initial workshop. And then we'll talk about the comprehensive plan amendments that we're going to have hearings on coming up in a few weeks. So this is our first rollout of those draft comprehensive plan amendments. I'm really hoping to get your feedback. I passed out a survey. You can fill it out this evening if you want. When we get to the part where I'll go through the plan amendment language, you can kind of track it against your survey questions, and if you want to fill it out then, that'd be great. If you want to take it home and think about it, I really want you to give it some thought. So I'm not necessarily asking people to make a snap decision on how they might view certain policies. I want you to give that some thought. So if you feel comfortable answering it tonight, that's fine. If not, we'll take your survey responses whenever you can get them to us. So to recap, phase one, we held a workshop on December 19th. We went through a lot of the technical analysis, and the next step is to prepare these comprehensive plan amendments that are required by statute. So I'm going to walk you through those statutory requirements, and then we're going to go through the draft comprehensive plan amendment itself. So I hope to get your input either this evening, verbally. You can ask questions, or ultimately give us some survey responses. So grant phase one, we really focused on two target years, 2040 and 2060, and for each target year we looked at sort of an intermediate intermediate forecast and a high forecast. I'm going to go through and explain a little bit about what that means. So these are sea level rise. Wherever you see SLR, that's sea level rise. So we've modeled that sea level rise. The Army Corps has a model that they use, and we've adapted it through some of our GIS work to help us produce outputs that where we can better understand how much of the city is impacted, the water depths resulting from that impact, and just get a little bit better idea than just from running the model the way the Corps has it set up. So just some sort of technical points for you to think about. So in order to better understand how much impact there will be, what we did was took the model and we joined it to the parcel level data. And what that lets us do is summarize that parcel information across the city and understand how much of the city is impacted in terms of acreage, the number of buildings, the water depths by parcel. So we have really detailed information. We looked at the age of structures. We looked at the assessed value of structures that would be impacted. We evaluated infrastructure, where are the water and sewer lines, where are the stormwater facilities that would be impacted by the sea level rise and by other types of flooding, storm surge, spring tides, high tides. So we'll walk through some of those details. As I mentioned, we held our workshop and we ended that phase one with a phase one report that summarized all of the findings that we reached in our analysis. And that sort of set up the next step to go through the comprehensive plan amendment. So here we are, it's phase two. We're in phase two. We started in basically January and took that month in order to draft comprehensive plan amendments. And we continued to analyze the results from phase one and thought about, what kind of policy interventions, what kind of policy strategies would work in a built-out area. As I mentioned, you can't just necessarily move people off the coast. So you have limited options. I'm going to walk you through what they call the peril of flood comprehensive plan amendment. So that's in Chapter 163 of Florida statutes. We'll go through that. Just to go over the schedule briefly, you have we have our workshop. We have our workshop this evening, and then we have a March 9th Planning Commission public hearing. Then we'll have a March 16th City Council public hearing, and that will be we call it the transmittal hearing. That's the hearing that local governments hold before they transmit the draft amendments to the state for review and comments. So that at that point, all the way through March 16th, nothing's been adopted. We're just preparing the plan amendments to transmit them to the state. The state will then have 30 days to review those amendments and give us feedback. And then we have the adoption hearing scheduled for April 20th. So it's moving along. I think there's enough time to give feedback to us. The issues aren't, you can get lost in the data. I can certainly tell you that. There's a lot of data. But we've done our best to summarize it to make it easy to understand. But when you boil it down to, well, what are we going to do from a policy perspective, the list is fairly limited. So I don't think anyone will have difficulty following through and understanding sort of the policy issues. So for those not familiar with sea level rise, and I'm sure you hear about climate change and on the news, I don't know how anyone couldn't at this point. But there are some interesting points about sea level rise most people don't understand. And most people, I think you hear about the news in terms of the glaciers melting. What you don't always hear about is the land subsiding in some areas. And that causes, interesting, almost 40% of the sea level rise is attributable to land subsidence. And then 30% is from thermal expansion from the ocean actually expanding as it heats up. So most people are focused on the right 30%, but on the far right, the glaciers. So it's a little bit more than rising up and coming over the, maybe a seawall or just expanding across, you know, from the intracoastal waterway, from the ICW. And that can happen, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's the direction and the way it occurs in this city. It actually comes from the ICW side of Jacksonville, not from the ocean. Most people would probably intuitively think it's the ocean. But the other thing I want to point out is the groundwater inundation. So if you think of your fresh water, it's kind of sitting on top of the saltwater layer of water, right? And as the sea level rises, it's going to breach. And so what happens is, not only do you have the sea level rise gradually coming up landward from the ICW, from the Intracoastal Waterway, you have it kind of bubbling up, if you will, and breaking the low spots, or inundating the low spots that you have in your community. So you get this ponding that happens, and it's a little different than, say, what happens with storm surge. Storm surge, it's just coming off the ICW, or it's coming off the ocean. This is coming literally up. That fresh water is coming up. We get all of our data from the Mayport tide gauge for this community. That's the closest tide gauge to Jacksonville Beach, and all of the tidal information that we use in the model is all driven by that particular tide gauge. This is the Army Corps'. It's a graph that I just copied from one of the websites that shows the Army Corps' low, medium, and high projections. So on the left side of the graph, you see the sea level rise in feet, and then on the bottom of the graph, going across, you see the target years, the future years. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we have 2 years that we studied, 2040 and then 2060. So you can see the difference in the curves, and we analyzed it based on the C4. That's the high risk, or the high projection curve. So we wanted to look at a relatively worst case scenario, and then we looked at the green, which is the intermediate. And there's a pretty significant difference between the two. So how does the model work? It relies on detailed data, bathymetry data, which is the elevation of the ocean bottom. It relies on LIDAR data, which is radar detection that gives us good detailed information on ground elevation. Part of our analysis that we did was to look at the sea level rise relative to the mean high water. So you might ask, well, why would you do that? Why would you compare it to mean high water versus mean high water? So a quick sort of description of those references. So your mean high water mark is, you have your mean sea level, you have your mean high water mark, then you have about 1 foot above that your mean higher high water mark. So again, we wanted to look at a fairly worst case scenario. And so at your mean higher water mark, that's already higher than a mean. It's higher than the average. And what happens when we add the sea level rise is it comes up another foot or so relative to mean high water. So that's a lot of technical jargon. It doesn't really matter that much, other than people that are technically knowledgeable about tides. They want to understand. We call that the benchmark. What are you comparing it against? And then we took the output from the model, and we converted it from inches. The model produces the water depths in inches, and it literally does that. It's a pixel, what we call a pixel model. So imagine every 3 meters by 3 meters, about 10 feet by 10 feet, we get a water depth reading from the model, and then we aggregate that data together, and that then allows us to produce contour lines, to produce those maps that you see across the back. All of those maps are output from our analysis effort, and before we finish, I'll just kind of give you a run through what those maps show, and you can take a few minutes and look at them. So spring tide, we're going to talk about that. It occurs twice per month. Some people think it's related to the springtime of the year. It's not. It just sort of means, I think they use springing because the tides are springing forth. So it doesn't have anything to do with the season. Our spring tide elevation at the Mayport tide gauge is 3 feet. And as I mentioned, it's 1 foot greater for mean high or high water. We're also going to compare and talk about what happens when we have sea level rise with spring tide versus sea level rise with storm surge. Two different kind of events. So storm surge, there's a separate model that runs that, and that tells us the areas that will flood as a result of a Category 1 hurricane. And you would think to yourself that probably well, that's going to be a lot worse than spring tide, but it's interesting in how close those numbers actually are. The spring tide plus sea level rise condition, looking at 2060, let's say, and you're trying to understand the flooding that would occur at spring tide, just about the same as the flooding that would occur from a Category 1 hurricane. And in the same areas as well, same geographic areas. So the general overview of the findings. The good news here is that most of the flooding occurs in conservation areas, in recreational areas, not in neighborhoods. So that's really good. The greatest water depths occur obviously closer to the water, closer to the intracoastal, and as the water spreads out, the water depths decline. So the greatest water depths are by the ICW. Stormwater systems will be impacted. That's one of, probably from an engineering perspective, the most challenging issue, because that water has to go somewhere, and if you're draining to a pipe and the end of the pipe is underwater, you have a problem. So we've looked at that issue. We're addressing it through our comprehensive plan policies, our draft policies, but we haven't done an engineering analysis. That would be a lot of additional work that will have to happen down the road if the city wants to try to evaluate in detail the stormwater systems. And many of these are private. It's not as though the city would be necessarily conducting an analysis of privately owned stormwater systems. That'll be up to those landowners whether they want to reevaluate their stormwater system. And if they're like my HOA, they're probably not going to want to spend the money on that. Hopefully they'll think about that issue, because it's better to spend some money on the front end if you can reduce the problem. So let's talk about, this gives you some numbers, gives you some idea of the extent of flooding. So this is the percent of acreage that's flooded. And the first category is again from sea level rise combined with a Category 1 hurricane. So 2040 C2, again C2 is your medium or intermediate scenario. It's not quite as bad as C4, and but you see the percentages. So 30% in 2040, the higher C4 results in a few additional percent, 33% flooding. At 2060, the lower projection is about 32%, and the higher one's at about 37% by 2060. But again, most of that's in conservation and recreational areas. So that's the most important point. This next graph or this next chart gives you the same numbers showing the acreage breakdown with the same format. And you see that the percentages are just a little bit lower compared to Category 1 in sea level rise. Here you have the sea level rise combined with spring tide, and the percent is just a 1 or 2% difference. So they're almost the same situation, which we didn't really expect that. I mean, once we started looking at the tide information, we realized before we even ran the model that was probably going to be the output.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Why are the conservation areas impacted the most?
Because they're the closest to the water.
Like,
And
can
so
you give me an example?
So, so if you look, when you drive over on Butler, you look out over all that salt, all the salt marsh areas, those areas are the first to get impacted. Out in the intercoastal, even before you get to land, the water's coming up there. And then even when you get to land areas within the city that are designated on your future land use map as conservation are the main areas that get flooded. So I don't know if you can see these percentages too well, but, sorry. So we have conservation is 66%, meaning 66% of the area that's flooded, out of the whole city, of the area that's flooded, 66% is in the conservation area. And then another 7.6% is in the recreation area. So those two together are over almost 3/4 of the areas that are flooded. So this wedge is the one we're mostly concerned about, residential, 22%. Yes, sir.
What's the minimum building height? I mean, you have to have, the lot has to be how high to get a building permit?
Well, that depends on the zone you're in.
And it's not necessarily the land, it's the structure. Your land can be within a flood zone, but if you're in a designated flood zone, I'll give you an example. One of the flood zones on the Intercoastal Waterway is elevation 5 feet. So regardless of your property, if you're in that flood zone, it doesn't matter what your land area is, but the habitable floor, your first habitable floor, and all the equipment servicing your building has to be 1 foot higher than that. So that's how we regulate it. It doesn't matter about the land around it. In fact, we discourage people from trying to fill their whole lots to get them out of the flood zone. The whole idea is to get the structure out of the flood zone and keep our infrastructure out of the flood zone.
Oh, that's interesting.
And if you look, so this first slide was again Category 1 storm surge in 2060. The pie looks pretty much the same on the next slide here, and that's your spring tides in 2060. So very similar pattern. There's a lot of information here, but what I want you to focus on is these are the water depths that would occur for buildings that are impacted by the sea level rise. So again, this is sea level rise plus spring tides. So in the 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 foot range, this is your worst case scenario under 2060 C4. That totals to about, the two red numbers total to about 78% of the structures that are impacted will be impacted by depths of 1 to 3 feet. And then, again, that's C4, that's your worst, your more intensive projection, or your worst case projection, if you will. The 2060 C2 is not, again, thinking back at those Army Corps curves, they're lower, but the intermediate, so the water depth's not as high, and that's why you have 70% of your buildings in that scenario in the 0 to 1. So they're not, you want to be on the left side of this graph. You don't want to be on the right side, it's where the water depths are getting bigger. 2040, again, the high projection scenario, most of the buildings are in the 1 to 2 foot range.
How much does it change between the different categories of storms? So if you're using a category 1 for these, did you look to see how it changes between 2, 3, 4, and 5?
No, because the slosh model output is category 1, and that's a good question. But when I come back for the council here, I'll come back with maybe an estimate on that for you. It's going to be a significant difference. I mean,
Yeah,
if
exactly.
you go from right, because I'm saying worst case in terms of sea level rise.
Right, exactly, but it's not worst case.
Not worst case by hurricane standards at all.
Okay.
Any questions on that table? Okay. This is the same table, but where I combine sea level rise and, again, the Category 1 storm surge. And you see the percentages are fairly similar to the last chart. Most of the problem occurs in the 0 to 1, 1 to 2 foot range. These are the assessed values for all of the structures that are impacted, and we've broken them down by land use types. You can see residential structures, commercial, industrial. And you see I've given, you know, the minimum value that we saw in our data set, and then the maximum value. And then I used the median. The reason is if you use averages, big numbers can skew the average, so we like to use the median.
Do you know what the highest flood level we've had to date, and how that would compare to the C2 Category 1? I mean, because I'm just trying to get an idea of when we had the last storm, we had the where we had the dunes breached. You know, how would that actually fall into this? I mean, I don't know if that was 1 foot or if that was 1.5 foot, or I'm just trying to get some kind of feel of, you know, what these numbers really
Well,
mean.
if it breached, if it breached out on the beach, then that's.
We had weaknesses in the dunes, so it didn't go over all of it, so it
Breached
went
voids in the dune.
Yeah, it kind of went through them, and I mean, in South Jacksonville Beach, I would say, I mean, there was areas where we had a foot of water on the street.
So intuitively, that's got to be worse, because none of these projections are breaching on the Atlantic side.
Okay.
But that's assuming there's a consistent barrier.
Yeah, so, okay, I'm just trying to figure out how, you know, just what we've experienced the last couple of years, is it gonna get worse? I mean, are these projections worse than what we've already seen, or how much worse are they?
That's a really good question, and so we'll look at that and see if we can find a good way to kind of give you a relative comparison, because I realize these numbers are, there are a lot of numbers, but it is sort of hard to understand the relative difference when you kind of compare it from storm event to storm event,
Yeah.
and you know, from different criteria. Yes, sir.
Thanks.
I'm trying to understand this. Would it be explained by saying that water seeks the easiest path, so the reason the intracoastal would go up first is because the water has connected to the ocean at the 2 inlets, and that's the reason it would find its way there, as opposed to a barrier of the beach?
Actually, it's more related to elevation, because if you drive down Tallwood Road or out in the sanctuary, and I'm not picking on neighborhoods, Evans Drive, all the marshfront, those streets, those streets are at elevation 6 feet, 7 feet. The backyards of the houses on the intercoastal are elevation 5 feet. The bulkhead on the ocean front is generally about 10 feet in elevation, so already the ocean, it seems counterintuitive,
So
but it's high.
practically
Yes, sir.
consistent.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay,
It's just lower.
Yeah,
lower
we'll get it.
property.
Big bird bath. Yeah. It seeks a level around the edge.
Mhm.
So this just gives you an idea of the relative magnitude, the potential. I mean, this is assessed value, so this is this is from the property appraiser data. It's not market. It's not the market value. Market value will be even worse. Figured 20% higher for market value. And you see the difference between 2040 C4 at 106 million and 2060 C4 at the top at 155 million. And then the same comparison for sea level plus spring tide, and kind of very similar breakdown.
Do you have sufficient knowledge now to say, you can get in the weeds deeper and deeper here, but that's not helping anything, the picture's there. Any sort of idea of what steps you would take?
Well, that's, yeah, great question. We're going to go through the draft comprehensive plan amendment, because that's, all of this data is meant to guide the city toward ultimately what policy changes the city wants to make to deal with the problem. So we're going to walk through that. And I'm just about done with the slides. Stormwater, as I mentioned, that's a real challenge. Most stormwater systems are based on a 25-year storm event. that's standard. It's not, probably 80% of the cities in Florida use 25-year, 24-hour as their design standard for their stormwater system. But the problem here is that data is showing that we're getting these storms more often, more frequently. And so these design standards are going to be out of date. And as a result, the stormwater system is not going to hold the same amount. It's not going to be able to hold, say, a 100-year storm event. And when you think about a Category 1, and you think about special flood hazard areas, think of those ballpark as 1% events, one in 100-year events. And we know they're occurring more often than that. But statistically, that's how they've approached it in the past. So we know these stormwater systems are not going to be adequate. They're not going to be up to the task. And then you have the compounding problem that the outfall can't generate positive discharge because there's nowhere for the water to go. So it's kind of a double whammy. So policy options, to your point, sir. So the first thing we like to look at is from a land use perspective, can we do anything to move the problem away? And the answer is pretty much no. I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about land acquisition, and we'll talk about what we think we can do potentially, but it's very expensive. So it'll take grant money, but we'll get into that. The main option is going to be elevating, bringing the structures up higher to get out of the water. So, you saw the tables before, 1 to 3 feet. Doesn't mean every house needs to come up 3 feet. Doesn't mean every house needs to come up 1 foot. Keep in mind, this is, again, a small percentage of the city, and you'll probably understand that even better when we look at the maps there. Another thing we can do is to try to increase open space and reduce impervious coverage. As a homeowner, you can do that whether the city adopts a regulation or not. So, I mean, you can take steps voluntarily to try to reduce your risk. And that will help to a point because you have more area for infiltration to occur. But think about it, if the sea level rise is bringing the water table up, you still have to have room for that water to be able to, for you to be able to hold that water in a stormwater system, and that's the challenge. We can look at increasing stormwater retention capacity, and then there may be some limited engineering solutions here and there, but I don't foresee, the city or any agency coming in trying to build a seawall along the Intracoastal Waterway. I just don't think that's going to happen. So here's the Florida statutes that govern what we're doing with the comprehensive plan. So every comprehensive plan, and think of it as your basic blueprint for growth. The comprehensive plan describes city policies and how you want to grow, how you want to see redevelopment occur, what the densities and intensities should be for those uses, what kind of land uses you want down near the coast versus further upland. Those are all the things that a comprehensive plan would address, and every city along the coast has what we call a coastal management element. And that element has to be based on these sort of studies that we do. And so the legislature created this law a few years ago, and it said every coastal element has to include a redevelopment component that outlines the principles that must be utilized or used to eliminate inappropriate and unsafe development in the coastal areas, and I underline this, when opportunities arise. That's really an important point because I don't think we're going to go out there tomorrow and just start clearing out subdivisions. So we have to look at when opportunities arise after storm damage, what can happen. And so then this subsection F goes on to say that the redevelopment component has to include the following requirements. I'm going to go through the 6. So we have to include development and redevelopment principles. We use a lot of terms. It's unnecessary, but it's just the way it is. Because I think they mostly mean the same thing. So they include development and redevelopment principles, strategies, and engineering solutions that reduce the flood risk in coastal areas which result from high tide events. So that's your spring tides that we've been talking about. Storm surge, that's your category 1 that we've been talking about. Flash floods, which is not really well defined, and there's no statistical number or database to really define what constitutes a flash flood. Stormwater runoff and the related impacts of sea level rise. Okay? And these are exact verbatim references here. These are not my words. These are from the statute. Second one is encourage the use of this will be the most important. Encourage the use of best practices, development and redevelopment principles, strategies, and engineering solutions that will result in the removal. I know how they wrote that. Result in the removal of coastal real property from flood zone designations. So it's not well written. There's no way we're going to move property out of flood zone designations. The land's going to be where the land's at. I think what they were really getting at are the buildings. Not sure why they didn't just say buildings. And in practice, what the state has said is, well, if you're in a built-up community like this, a relatively built-out community, removing the property from the flood zone designations doesn't mean we're going to be able to necessarily relocate. It means we're going to remove it by going up. So that gets, again, it's not really removing it from the flood zone. You're still in the flood zone, but the damage will be less if you elevate the structures. And so when we go through our policies, we've approached that issue by proposing a policy to require additional elevation. And then identify site development techniques and best practices that may reduce losses due to flooding and claims under the insurance program. So, of course, the state's concerned about, public safety, human lives, but there's also a big money issue behind the whole effort. I mean, the insurance industry has struggled to remain solvent in dealing with storm events, and so money is a significant part of this issue. And then the last 3 I grouped because they don't really require any new policies for the city. Well, we actually added some, but these are not what I would call significant sort of regulatory decisions. They're mandates from the state. So, and they're really just saying what the law already says.
And we're already doing.
And that the city's already doing. So, the law already requires that that development comply with the Florida Building Code, and your ordinance already does that. Number 5 requires that construction activities occur seaward of the coastal construction line, and you include that requirement already. And then number 6 encourages local governments to participate in the community rating system, which is it's a rating system that the federal government, the National Flood Insurance Protection Program, has come up with to allow local governments to reduce their premiums. In other words, if you participate in the community rating system, you get scored as a community, and the better your score, the lower your premiums, your insurance premiums. And the city's a 6 right now, which is good. I see communities ranging from we don't want to participate in the community rating system at all, we'll just do the minimum that the law requires, to most that fall somewhere between probably 6 and 9. It's hard to, there's a menu, there's a laundry list of activities that the local government can pursue to try to incrementally increase your score. And I think, Bill, you were mentioning you brought the city's score up over time.
1994, when I started working here, we were in a class 9, and now we're up to a class 6. And it takes a lot of work. I mean, we're a 2-person staff, but having a class 6, that means if you have a property that's in a flood zone and you're required to carry supplemental flood insurance, I think the discount's 20% in class 6. So it's significant.
it's pretty good.
But beyond that, trying to go up to scale is a Herculean effort on our part, and a lot of communities in the state will get about high as a 6 or a 5, and then you'll find some states in the Midwest, you know, that don't have a lot of flooding issues. They're class 1, class 2, but they don't really have the real issues that we have to deal with.
Right, right. So that's the presentation, excuse me. And now what I'd like to do is,
Can you pull up that
is
Word
if we,
document?
yeah, if we can pull up the comprehensive plan amendments, we'll just walk through them. Any questions while she's setting that up? I know it's like a crash course if you're not familiar with this sort of information.
I
Yes, sir.
always thought it was coming through the front door, but you say it's coming through the back door. How long is, where we are, there's a, built in the 30s, there's a seawall that only it's totally under the sand now by about 2 feet. But when we first moved here, the sea came right up to that seawall.
Mhm.
And it's like 18 feet with a 3-foot cap on it. And it was built in the WPA or something like that. Does that go all along Jacksonville Beach?
Yes, sir, it does predominantly. There's some areas where oceanfront properties have, either the land area in the backyards have accreted over it, or in some cases, the dune has accreted backwards on it.
Yeah,
But
the
that
dune's
coastal
coming
structure
right
is still
up.
there, right? And
The
the old,
dune's about to come in.
right, and the old boulders that used to be out when you could drive
Yeah.
on the beach, they're still down there.
Yeah.
It's just that through the beach renourishment efforts over every 7 years since the 40s or 50s, the beach has gradually built up and we're having a positive effect. So the coastlines, we're pushing the mean high water line further out into the ocean.
We're supposedly at plus 16, but as I said,
Where do you live?
Right up
We're
to the
on
south end.
south end of Jacksonville.
On the oceanfront?
Yeah.
Yeah, what you'll deal with on most of the oceanfront properties, there's actually the remnants of an older era dune that your house is built on, because a lot of your driveways going down onto Duval or First or wherever you are, it's a fairly steep driveway, so it's a good thing.
All right, so let's go through, so these are the draft amendments that we've prepared. Now, you know, I want to emphasize that ultimately, this will be a city council decision as to the scope of the amendments that the city wants to adopt, but you have to start somewhere. And so we drafted amendments that we think, that we believe are consistent with the statutory requirements that meet the statute, the 6 points that we went through a few minutes ago. But I'll say there are a number of important policy decisions to make. I mean, for example, if you're going to elevate structures more than the law requires today, how much more? And that's a policy decision. We can talk about, well, what's the kind of range that we typically see from local governments? And we know from those water depth charts about what we can expect in terms of the water depth. So we'll go through these, but I just want you to understand these are draft. So we really want to get your feedback. If you like certain policies a lot, let us know. You'll see in the survey that I've given you, I've asked you to sort of score them in one of the 5 categories that you either strongly agree or somewhat agree, or you don't care, you're neutral on the issue, or you somewhat disagree or you strongly disagree with each of the policies. I haven't included every policy that I'm going to go through here in the little survey I gave you, but it picks up the ones that I think involve the most significant sort of policy issues in terms of how development would be, how a redevelopment would occur on a parcel of land. In other words, how it would impact an individual property owner.
Are you gonna get swamped with lawsuits? Can you forecast that? Lawsuits coming at you from everywhere when you declare an area that's too low to develop unless you put it on stilts?
Well, no, I don't think we would expect a lot of lawsuits. I'd be surprised if we get any lawsuits. But I'll talk about why that is as we go through. Okay, so, of course, I work for a law firm, so I do know people can sue over anything. We deal with it daily on a daily basis. All right, so first we have a goal, and let me say this about your comprehensive plan. You have a lot of good policies throughout your comprehensive plan that deal with flooding issues. And they're in different elements. So we have a future land use element to the comprehensive plan. You have some flood mitigation policies in there already. You have some flood mitigation policies in your coastal management element, in your conservation element,
Recreational open space.
in your recreation open space, in your aquifer recharge elements. So you already deal with a lot of these issues, but what we try to do here, I think, to keep it easier for everybody to follow, is we're recommending that we include this as a new goal and as a new objective as part of your coastal management element, so all of these policies will be in the same place. All the policies we're proposing, we put them in the same place in the coastal management element. That way we're not having to go into 6 different elements to do strike through and underlines and make edits. This just makes it easier to present, and I think it makes it easier for people to understand as well. So objective C4, this is meant to be a catch-all that the city would adopt and implement policies, regulatory standards, administrative procedures, possibly incentives, and other strategies to reduce sea level rise, or the vulnerability to sea level rise and these other types of flooding, high tide events, and so forth. You know, it doesn't have to always be regulation. Oftentimes incentives do a better job than regulation. And so, go ahead and scroll down. And is there a way to, you think we can reduce the font without, can you see it well right now?
So far.
How about that?
Right.
You guys okay?
Yeah.
All right. So let's scroll just a little bit more and see if we can get 1 through 5 up. All right, so we'll stop there. So the first one, part of what I think is important to do is to start integrating sea level rise concerns into all of the work that's being done in the city. And so we're suggesting that we have an objective here that we're going to, in policies, that we're going to evaluate the comprehensive plan, which we've done as part of our work. But that's just the comprehensive plan. We also want to go through and evaluate ultimately the code and the regulatory standards, like we were talking about, the elevation, impervious surface ratios, those sort of things. So number 1 is intended to do that, to make it a regular evaluation that occurs periodically in the city, because unfortunately these numbers are going to change over time. And if things don't change, those numbers are going to get worse, not better. And so I don't see this effort today as a static effort. Unfortunately for Bill, he's going to find himself periodically having to do this and look at it again when numbers get a lot worse. But
My successor.
what's that?
Or my successor.
Yeah. So, it's just something that we all have to try to keep up with. The second one, and the second one is actually in your survey. It's the first question I asked in the survey, number 7. I reworded it a little bit in your survey, and I give a little explanation. So the explanation is that today, your comprehensive plan allows offsetting density increases and density reductions in the coastal high hazard area. So your coastal high hazard area is the area that would flood from a Category 1 hurricane. So it's the storm surge that we've been looking at. That's your Category 1. And a lot of local governments have this policy. So if they wanted to, if a property owner wanted to increase density on one parcel they own and reduce it on another parcel, and they're both in the same coastal high hazard area, and the density's offset, and it's a wash, right? So you see this policy in a lot of comprehensive plans. But what we're suggesting is that we revise it or add this additional policy to say that's okay, but let's not do the increase in the worst areas. Let's not do the increase in the 2060 C4 areas. In fact, it would be even better if there's an increase elsewhere and you're doing an offsetting reduction, do the decrease do the offsetting decrease of density in these areas that are most susceptible to flooding. Do I see that really happening much? No. I really don't see that. Because normally those trade-offs occur where, as a developer, I have a couple of parcels that I want to offset. want to build on one because I think that it's better for the market, or for whatever reason, I want to increase density on one, and I'm willing to reduce it on the other. But most of the color you see on those maps are single-family homes. Those inundated areas are single-family, so they're not really set up to allow for reduction in density as sort of a trade-off. So I think that will be a very, again, go back to the statute, it said when opportunities arise. So there may be an opportunity here or there where you might be able to move densities in a way that helps. I think the main point of this policy is don't make it worse. And if you can make it a little better, good idea. And then the third one is to ensure that the regulatory review, subdivisions, when you file plats, again, we're already built out. I don't see, there may be a plat amendment now and then, but probably not much. You probably won't see much in that vein. Same for PUDs. What you will see are individual site plan reviews. That's what you're going to see mostly. And so we're just saying, as part of that, we're going to make sure we're enforcing these policies and regulations, which I know the city would be doing. Number 4 and 5. This is tying into the budgetary process. So let's make sure that as the city council and departments are considering their budget, that they're thinking about these sea level rise issues, and they already are, because as I mentioned before, the comprehensive plan already includes a lot of policy direction on dealing with flooding. So we're not really covering new ground. We may be sharpening it up a little bit as to some of these particular issues. 5 is important to give priority to infrastructure improvements that would actually, and engineering solutions that would increase public health and safety. And again, that's set in different ways already in your comprehensive plan. That notion is already in there, but we've made it specific to dealing with flood resiliency. Yes, ma'am.
Is the intent there to cover like green infrastructure? Does it have to be an engineered solution, or could it be a more natural resource?
It could be natural, either.
Because I'm not sure it says that.
Can you go back? So, we're talking about infrastructure here, which would normally be, water, sewer, stormwater. But, make a note of that, if you would. And certainly, this is not intended to preclude some green solutions if they're there. Excuse me, if they're there, and we can add a little bit of language to emphasize that point. It's good comment. Yeah. So the next one is to implement redevelopment and development strategies. And so this whole set of policies focuses on the idea that we might be able to over time reduce the amount of density that's actually occurring in those colored areas on the map. And so the idea would be, and I don't see this happening except when there might be storm damage. So you've had a hurricane, a part of a neighborhood is wiped out. In a worst case scenario, you get a Cat 4 or Cat 5 hurricane, and you've got significant parts of neighborhoods that are level. If that happens, that's the time that those property owners would have the ability to come to the city and say, I'm not sure I want to rebuild here. I might be better off either trying to sell my lot, in which case, in an ideal world, it would be put into some sort of conservation use, or maybe they just sell the property rights off of the property. Single-family homeowners are just going to want to sell their lot. There's not going to be no one's going to be interested in just selling their development right, because there's no difference between the two. But there could be other differences between the value, the fee simple value of property for commercial and for multifamily versus buying down some of the development rights. So maybe on a multifamily building or a commercial building, maybe they want to stay there, but they don't feel like they need to rebuild quite at the same level they have. Maybe they're willing to sell some of their development rights reduce their density in half, reduce their commercial floor area in half, and get compensated for it. So the city can pursue those kinds of programs by asking the state and the feds to step up to the plate. I mean, local governments can't do this by themselves, and none of these solutions are cheap. These are expensive programs. To buy out development rights costs a lot of money. We did it a lot in the Florida Keys. I worked down there for many years. It's an expensive proposition, but if the state and the federal agencies come to the table and they see enough value, well, then you can make headway on those sort of programs. From a conservation perspective, I think we would want to try to identify those areas where we can, and this is B, where we can prioritize where we get the most bang for your buck, right? You get the most public benefit out of acquiring a piece of property or reducing density on a piece of property. Same for, another targeted area would be try to identify properties that have higher vulnerability population types. So low income areas, for example, that are that may not have structures that are you may have older structures, or you may have an assisted living facility, for example, for elderly that, in an ideal world, we don't want our ALFs, we don't want our independent living and assisted living and nursing care facilities to be in our worst flood areas. So over time, you try to move those out. Now, it seemed like when I looked at when we went through the analysis, I didn't see any ALF or nursing homes. I did see.
One step below that, though, elderly oriented.
That's what I was going to ask
housing.
you. It's like an
Private
ILS.
apartments. Yes, sir. It's independent.
Independent.
It's Pablo Hamlet at the end of Cheddar Avenue.
Okay. So that might be one that you would look at. So let's scroll down some more. These are the same ideas, just where you'd buy up part of the development rights. And again, I don't want anybody to get shook up or get worried about the city budget over this issue, because the city will need help from the state and the federal agencies to ever implement a program like this. So let's go to number 3. So I've identified this. So let me mention before I get too far, I mentioned earlier number 7 dealt with the idea of those offsetting densities, and number 8 also deals with that same kind of question. 9 on your survey list talks about reducing public expenditures, or giving priority for infrastructure improvements to protect the public health and safety. So we went through that policy. I probably should have just referenced these one by one as we did it. Sorry, I'm catching you up. And now we're on number 10 on your survey. So regulations, Bill mentioned earlier, flood zone regulations is based on federal law in the state building code require a minimum of 1 foot elevation above the base flood elevation. So every flood zone has its own base flood elevation. I think you've got them all with depths here, don't you?
We don't have depth. Oh, yeah, we do.
You got
All A zones. We have very few unnumbered A zones anymore.
So we know the base flood elevation on all the parcels, and you have to, we call it freeboard, you have to have 1 foot of freeboard, for you voters out there, above the base flood elevation. And so this would increase it to 1.5 feet. Is there any magic to that additional 6 inches? Not particularly.
Well, one thing it should point out, though, is that's an incremental increase. Over time, I see the freeboard being increased more than 1.5 feet, but you're talking about the scenario between now and 2040 and now and 2060, as opposed to just putting in unrealistic for the construction community, for people living out here. We feel it's better to incrementally increase that, and our first increment would be a 1/2 foot above the requirement, which also, you talked about the CRS credit that we get. That will give us additional points towards potentially trying to get to a class 5, getting a little better discount on flood insurance premiums. But But it's not the end all to say we just wanna go a half a foot above the building code. Ultimately, over time, I will see that, I do see that as being increased over. But initially, we think the incremental approach to raising the building elevations is much more prudent.
I agree, and I'm glad you made that comment, because that goes back to my earlier comment. This is not static. These numbers are going to change over time. Both the risk will change as well as the regulatory approach that might be taken. Yes, sir.
What kind of cost would be involved in another foot? I mean, how much more expensive is it per foot to go, why not go 3 feet above?
Well, you've got the option of doing that. It's just setting a minimum above which, I can't really tell you what the actual dollar value would be, but keep in mind, we're talking about reconstruction. We're not talking about elevating your existing house above a half foot. It's over time when your house or whatever your structure is no longer viable. Somebody buys your property for your property, not for the house.
Rebuild.
Yeah, it's a course of block. If you're gonna build on stem walls anyway, basically a half a foot, a cinder block's 8 inches tall. So it's just when you come back up, instead of maybe putting 2 courses of cinder block around your slab, you put an additional block up. And that's just the structural cost of the house. It's got nothing to do with what's above the slab. That wouldn't change.
FEMA did a study where they show, you know, the benefit. Now, this was some sort of sampling, but you know, the benefit in terms of reduced premiums based on how high you go. And I'll bring that chart next time. It's interesting to look at.
Yeah, 3 questions. When you say number 10, you say 6 inches. You mean 6 inches on top of the 1.5 foot?
6
So the
inches.
2 feet?
6 inches on top of the 1 foot freeboard that's already required.
Okay, so the 6 inches is the 1.5. Okay.
Yes.
The second question is, when you back over on the other questions, when you're talking about density changes, would the density change be, you don't have a single family home, if you had somebody came in and bought a subdivision that was in a flood zone, and he wanted to raise all the homes up, say 6 feet, would that effectively satisfy the proposed policy?
Yeah,
Because
there's no mandate for anyone to sell their house.
I understand that, I'm just saying
Yeah.
that just as clarification of what's meant by the proposed policy.
That wouldn't be increasing density, so no, it wouldn't negatively affect that policy.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just,
The third question is sort of like what you were going on. One of the things, I don't know if you covered in here, are you, if you do have storm damage on a home, do you want to set a certain criteria at which point it's going from repair to new repair to construction?
It's
or-
gonna get to that in a little bit. It's the cumulative effect of damage over, right now, we do it on an individual event. Hurricane X comes through, if your house is damaged less than 50% of its market value, then you can reconstruct it based on however it was before. If it exceeds 50% of the value of the structure, at that point, the only time we'll issue a permit is if you come into compliance with the flood regulations. And right now, it's on a per event basis, and there's a policy in there that proposes it to spread that out to 2 years. So if one storm gets you 1 year, does 20% damage, the next storm comes a year later, and it adds another 40%, then cumulatively over that 2-year period, at that point, you need to rebuild your house per our current code. And that's a proposal.
and that's number 4 here.
sorry.
It's in the draft amendments. And we're seeking your feedback on it, because we have that same policy as item 11 on your survey. You anticipated where we were going with that, and that's,
I know the key is.
it's important because how often so when these structures are below the required elevation, they're called non-conforming structures, right? They're legal, but they don't conform to the current code. And so when you do have substantial damage or substantial improvements defined at 50%, then you have to improve them. But as Bill mentioned, you can get repetitive damage to a structure over, from 2 storms in a year or from multiple storms over multiple years. And I will tell you, around the state, I see that it ranges from permit by permit, where there's no cumulative analysis, which is how the city does it today.
That's our current state.
I've seen it at 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. I've seen it at 5. I've seen it at 10, and I've seen it for the lifetime of the structure. It seems a little strange to me.
Let me put one point of clarification. Ours is not necessarily based on the individual permit. If you've had damage that goes unrepaired, we would pick it up, because as soon as you pull your permit, well, you didn't fix your garage from last year, so you're gonna fix it now. So we would catch it cumulatively, unless every time something incremental happens, you run out and get a permit for it. Then at that case, we're only catching what your next permit's for. So it depends on how people react to, historical storm damage.
And the idea here is we're really trying to capture where we're getting regular repetitive damage. Because we go back to the statute's asking us to figure out a way to reduce all the claims that the state and the insurance companies are dealing with. And so the idea is let's try to recognize when we're having repetitive damage. And by the way, there are also benefits besides the CRS, the community rating system, where you can get low interest loans, for example, if your structure, if the local government has adopted a repetitive damage policy like this, then FEMA will give you a significant break on a low interest loan for doing improvements beyond just what you might get through your insurance program. Yes, sir.
I know every coastal town in Florida's got this, and I guess the interior as well. There is no template where you all say it's agreed that all these things are desirable and needful.
I think I'm hesitant to say there's consensus all over the state, but I will say I think people are more and more recognizing that they have to pursue these measures. Now, there are minimum standards everyone has to meet, and that the city has already met. Now, these are new statutory requirements, so they're adopting new policies. But there's still local government discretion on how far they want to go with policies, and the idea of balancing, as Bill was mentioning, the idea of balancing the need to incrementally change over time to reduce the threat and balance that against the economic impact on homeowners and commercial property owners. So local governments balance that differently. Every local government's a little different on how they reach that balance, that equation, and that's purely that's a decision of the city council. So we're providing them with the analysis to help them understand what the data is telling us and what the forecasts are telling us, and then we're trying to give them a menu of options to think about in terms of policy approaches. All right. Number 5 is limiting public expenditures that would tend to encourage development in these vulnerable areas. So we already talked about an infrastructure policy that was designed to try to improve public health and safety. At the same time, we have another policy on infrastructure saying we need to be careful as we look at each infrastructure decision. Is it helping or is it going to aggravate the problem? And so this one is saying, let's not aggravate the problem. And so if someone wanted to, and again, this has limited applicability in this city because of how built out the city is, but think of a redevelopment scenario, an entire neighborhood is wiped out. At that point, the city has to think about, are we going to go back in and do all the repair work to the infrastructure to support that subdivision? And maybe it makes sense to try to cluster those densities in a different way than they previously were laid out. Those are the opportunities that a built-out community has to look at. And so the idea with all of these policies is to get ahead of that. You don't want to start thinking about these options when the storm hits. So you have to think about them in advance while it's nice and sunny outside, and think through the long-term decisions and how those will affect the community. So So number 6 is intended to deal with the drainage system. Again, these are not, so we have public and private drainage systems. So the city, this policy would call for the city to ensure that it's maintaining the drainage ditches under its jurisdiction and to encourage other agencies that have jurisdiction over any of the stormwater to do the same. And then also to require private systems to undergo similar kind of maintenance schedules. Over time, these ditches build up. That's just the way it is. And so you have to do periodic maintenance. I think you already have some code provisions about that, but
Well, and in practical policy, we do that policy statement right now.
you have to.
Especially during pre-hurricane season, after storms, but we do it all the time.
So again, nothing new. We've kind of packaged this up, to give more focus to it in the comprehensive plan. So this next policy set talks about how we can potentially use regulations and incentives to try to reduce the vulnerability. So you'll see on your survey questions 12, 13, 12 and 13 both deal with some of these regulatory issues. And then the final question, number 14, deals with the infrastructure that we were just talking about. So, one thing that local governments sometimes do, we need to evaluate these parking code requirements in the city's code is, commercial interests tend to push for significant parking allocations, right? So a shopping center might want 5 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. The retailers tend to want a lot of parking. That's changing a little bit because of the way that the retail industry is adapting to the internet competition. But that's still, I hear it all the time still, because I mostly work with private developers and, in a grocery store, will say, we're not going to just put in the city's minimum. The city only requires 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet, and I'm just using this generically. I'm not sure what your city standard is here for retail, but oftentimes it's around 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet or 1 space per 300 square feet of floor area.
We're close. We're 1 to 250 for shopping centers, 1 to 200 for general commercial.
So pretty standard. And then, the retailer comes in and they want, 1 space per 200 square feet for their grocery store. So some local governments are adopting maximum thresholds. So you have minimum amount of parking and then setting a maximum cap. And that can limit the amount of impervious surface on property, which of course impacts drainage. So that's one strategy, is to look at ways to make sure that you're limiting your parking. Another is just, we've dealt with this in a number of areas where you try to use a different type of material than just an impervious asphalt or impervious concrete. They're getting better and better with some of these products. It used to be, when I was younger, we'd do brick pavers. And they look nice if they're really maintained well, but developers tend not to like them because they become a maintenance headache. But now they're coming out with pervious concrete. It sounds like the 2 words wouldn't go together, but there are some products out there that absorb stormwater even through special concrete materials that have different attributes. So we want to look at opportunities to reduce parking, opportunities to reduce driveway sizes. It's common to require cross connections between properties. That's often done for access control, so you don't have too many access points going down the roadway. And that may or may not result in a reduction in impervious surface. Sometimes it can lead to more. So you have to look at that kind of on a case-by-case basis. That would all be things that your code could address, and that Bill and his staff would, look at when they're doing site plan reviews to determine when it's appropriate to apply some of those standards. Also, just reducing, and again, this would be in a redevelopment strategy if the part of a subdivision is wiped out and you're coming back and they're redesigning a bit, maybe they can reduce the width of the roads a little bit.
And that standard you propose is 2 feet narrower than our current 24-foot standard, so.
Right, so, knock off.
It's still 11-foot travel lane.
Right. It's a safe number, and, your city engineer will want to make sure that they're following the engineer green book to make sure that, to your point earlier, that they don't get lawsuits over something like that. So as long as they're following accepted standards, they should be fine. And then we just had a couple of policies about coordinating with the University of Florida. And, the agencies can help, but so can some of these NGO groups, these non-government organizations, whether that's a university. The universities are really into these issues. They can help. In fact, the Neptune staff are there, told me that they're working with UF. And then public education. So, I think it's important that people understand on a site-by-site basis what their choices are. People don't typically break open the local government code book and read it, and they don't have to. Staff does a great job on their website at describing the FEMA program, the flood issues. But for an individual property owner, and if they're rebuilding, if it's time to replace the driveway, maybe you think of narrowing it down or using a different material. Individual property owners can make some decisions whether there's a regulatory standard or not. I think that's. So the rest of these are just the 3 standard policies that we had to include that the city already does. So there's no real policy decisions on those last 3. So that's the set of amendments. It's a mix of limited land use strategies, regulatory standards, education, incentives. City council is going to have to look at these and think about, from a policy perspective, what the city council thinks is the appropriate standard in some cases to adopt, or the policy direction. That's their decision. The first hearing we're going to have will be coming up on March 9th before the Planning Commission, who's your local planning agency. And the Planning Commission will go through a similar type of hearing, probably a little shorter, and they'll make their recommendations to the City Council. And then we'll have our March 16th City Council transmittal hearing. So you have time to plenty of time to give input. I'd encourage you to submit your survey responses to us. We really do want to see what you have to say about these issues, and get a feel for it. And you can submit comments in addition to the survey responses. If you want to submit an email or you want to submit a letter to talk about any concerns you have, or to say that you agree, what you agree with and don't agree with, that's fine.
And also, if you want to share this with other people, this is live streamed on YouTube right now. So you can go on the YouTube general page and just type in City of Jacksonville Beach. And any meeting that we have live streamed is usually available after the fact. So if you've got a question, or you want to hear something again that Ken might have said, I don't believe, because of the way our room is set up, it doesn't pick up on the screen, but you can hear his materials. And we'll have a copy of the PowerPoint in our office if somebody wants to contact us for that.
All of these maps that you see are in that phase 1 report that I mentioned.
And that's available in our office.
That's available online, so you can pull it up as a PDF and you can look at any of these maps. One thing I'll mention about the maps is on the bottom of each one, it tells you whether it's the sea level, it tells you the year of the sea level rise analysis that was done for that particular map. So it'll tell you the year, it'll tell you whether it's the intermediate risk or the high risk scenario, and it'll tell you whether it's combined with sea level rise in spring tide or combined with sea level rise in category 1.
One
So,
correction to the statement, the phase one report is not online yet due to the graphics. We're having some issue with trying to support that internally. We do have the paper copies of the maps in our office, and we do have a copy of the report in the office.
yes, sir.
Well, I had what I think is a great idea about impervious surface change, what I told you, or should I discuss it?
Me.
The alleys, they're in the midst of planning to pave over every single alley in Jack's Beach east of Third.
Well, from Beach Boulevard down to 13th anyway.
Why pave over all that when you've got all that nice sand that can suck water down?
It's a good question for the design engineers. They are, well, a lot of
It's
it's,
pretty much line one, so I mean, it's not,
yeah,
it's
it's not as
really
impervious as you think it would. There are some sand areas, and there are some alleys that aren't even developed, but especially east of Third Street, a lot of our alleys provide either primary or secondary parking access for a lot of those properties.
Well, I'm thinking the ones with, mine literally face the one between 9th and 10th south.
Oh, you're in 9th and 10th, so you're the next, you're not in this phase, you're the next phase up. Well, you may want to, when they do that, we have workshop. That whole area from 13th back up to Beach Boulevard, they're doing 13th to 11th right now. That's probably, we call that Project 2. Project 3 will be the next project going north. You'll be in that. They'll have public workshops for input in that. That might be a good point of discussion. In fact, I'll remember to say that anyway, so.
Okay.
And it may just be on a block by block assessment. It's like, well, do we need this alley there? Or, you know, is it required?
It is impervious, I mean, it is
Passable,
impervious.
completely passable right
But
now.
like he said, a lot of them have been lime rock in the past, so there may be a nice layer of dirt, but below that, if it's hard lime rock, water's not going down anyway.
Never floods.
That's good.
Yes, sir.
Sorry to be so noisy, but it looks
No,
like all
what's your
this is,
input?
all this is scratching away at little here and there. Is there anything other than land acquisition? Are there any great acquisitions that would tend to actually change the game a little bit? Or are they pretty well already acquired? The marshes underwater, of course, are going to stay that way, but
Yeah,
Well,
the
we'd still like to
conservation
acquire
lands
some of
are-
those properties in the marsh. We're still looking to do that, but it's a cost matter. You know where the Cradle Creek Preserve is? You know where our little nature park is?
I have not.
Yeah, well, anyway, when I started working here, it was slated to be, I think it was a 100-lot subdivision. And we bought that land on purpose because it's out in the middle of the marsh. It's great habitat, it's some of the only remaining coastal habitat we have. But as importantly, it didn't cause putting new development in harm's way. So, I mean, we're proud we got that. We'd like to maybe get the property north of Second Avenue, you know, the road that goes to the boat ramp.
Yeah.
And it goes out to Safe Harbor. We'd like to be able to acquire that, but as as an independent small city of 23,000 people, we don't have the financial resources to buy that property right now. But that's definitely,
County's
that's on our
getting ready
list.
To try and raise $30 million to get some stuff, and, that's the only thing that you presented that does anything except knock the edges a little bit.
Right.
Well, I think elevating structures,
Yeah, that will do a lot.
It's really
Well,
important.
Accommodating a bad situation. And,
well, it
I
is.
think it's right. It's like the Keys, they made, if you did any repairs, but you had to jump it 10 feet up or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, which, yeah, it was 10 feet. It was, everybody was parking under their houses now.
Yeah, I mean, and I like to be realistic with people. I've worked with land acquisition programs for 30 years, and they don't want to, I mean, frankly, they just don't want to buy high and dry dirt. And even though this is getting submerged, it's not habitat in these neighborhoods. Now, you know, we did an analysis, and there's no question as that sea line moves landward, as your mean high water line moves landward, you're going to see a little bit of a shift of habitats right along the shoreline. But it's not going to just creep up landward and go throughout. You know, you're not going to see these subdivisions completely change over to conservation lands. And so when you go to the agency's priorities for acquisition, conservation's at the top, and these sort of subdivisions are at the bottom. Now, you know, I'm hoping you might see some additional priority given by agencies for areas that are highly susceptible to flooding. But I think when they do that, they're going to look first at whether there are any conservation values that they're going to benefit from. And that's just how the agencies look at it.
Looking at the map and sort of reading over this sort of scares me. We live in the sanctuary subdivision, and on all these maps it's underwater. And so some of the rules, I guess, kind of, we had a water study done for the subdivision, and a significant amount of Jacksonville Beach water drains into our subdivision. And, you know, the question for looking at this is looking at these maps, is this gonna be like, okay, that subdivision is lost? We're not gonna do anything because it's gonna be underwater, it's just not gonna, there's nothing we can do.
I think it depends on the scenario. So, I mean, if you have a category 5, that subdivision and many others are gonna be, really damaged, and that's gonna be a different scenario. But these,
We're not too far from king tides in our subdivision.
right, and so and that's why it's so important, because these are incremental changes that are occurring over time. The problem just gets a little worse and a little worse and a little worse if you accept the projections that the models show. And so I think what will more likely happen is structures sustain damage from, I wouldn't call it nuisance flooding, but some people would use that term. You get a foot of water and it does some damage to your door maybe, and maybe the bottom of your walls, but it's not, it's not catastrophic damage or anything. And then you file a claim, and so that damage is going to get recorded. And if more damage occurs within the 2-year period, if that policy is adopted, eventually what that does is causes the structure to have to get changed and elevated. And so the timing of how soon that will occur for any given person, just depends on their location and the scenario.
One thing to directly address your comment, and it's not in this presentation, but you know how you get out of your neighborhood to come down to 3rd Street up Jacksonville Drive?
Mhm.
We're doing a drainage project right now, the Ocean Terrace Drainage Study, specifically to divert all that water that's gravity flowing down the back. Because everybody's backyard from Grande back towards y'all just goes
Right.
downhill.
Yeah, that's what the.
Well,
study
we're
is.
sizing that stormwater system. Basically, the drainage divides right at Grande, so everything west of Grande goes down into Lake Sanctuary. Everything east comes back. We're terminating that drainage pipe, so the areas between Grande and America Avenue, we'll be able to pick that up and pump that back up north. That's part of what we're working on right now in that Ocean Terrace drainage study. And it's not a catch-all, and it won't cure everything, but it will help to the extent that water outside of the subdivision is not being treated through your subdivision.
Okay.
So we're trying.
And that's an example of where one of the policies talked about, let's do some infrastructure improvements where we can address public health and health safety and welfare. That's a good example. So the city's doing much of this. So to his point earlier, there are no major changes from a policy perspective here. So you can call it nibbling at the edges. We're not proposing that the city try to just come in and use eminent domain, for example, to buy out. It just wouldn't make sense. So this is a measured approach on what can be done over time and to reduce the problem. But it's not a panacea. I almost think of it more as, I wish the statute hadn't used the word engineering solutions. I think management is a lot better word. This is a problem we're managing. It's not a problem we're going to just solve. The only way you're going to solve it is to literally move people out of the area, and it's just not realistic, in my view, in this community. Any other questions? I'd encourage you to take a look at the maps on your way out, and like we said, we'll get those posted on the internet as soon as they resolve their capacity issue there. Thank you. Oh yeah, turn your surveys in if you've completed them.